first speaker tonight is Dr. Gail Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is a former researcher at the University of Guelph, Bridgetown campus, with experience as an academic and in dairy nutrition technical services. Currently, she's a teaching professor at Iowa State University. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you, Michelle. This morning, or this afternoon, this evening, whatever time it happens to be, I know not everybody's even going to be watching it all tonight. You'll be watching a recording later. But at this time, I'm going to be discussing our experiences feeding switchgrass to dairy cattle. So we've done several years worth of research feeding switchgrass to lactating dairy cows and dry cows in various types of diets. And so the purpose of this presentation was to kind of pull together all of some of the lessons learned from all of the different research projects that we've done over the past couple years. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the purpose of straw in dairy diets. So we've been looking at switchgrass largely as a replacement for wheat straw in dairy cattle diets. And I want to start by talking about why we would feed straw in the first place. So first of all, straw is a source of effective fiber. So I know that both Becca and Bridget are going to talk about effective fiber to some extent in their presentations. Effective fiber is basically fiber that plays a physical role in the rumen. So it is measured by particle size. Longer particles are considered to be effective versus very fine chaff or very short particles. And the function of the effective fiber, physically effective NDF in the rumen is a combination of scratch factor, so actually physically sloughing the rumen wall, the formation of the rumen mat in the rumen, and it promotes chewing. So it promotes the actual process of rumination. So that's often why straw is included in dairy cow diets. So the forage itself is important in dairy diets. And straw, even though it doesn't provide a whole lot of nutrition, it does provide some of that physical effect of the fiber. However, there is significant price variation in straw from year to year. And so that can sometimes lead to variations in how much straw we're feeding to dairy cows. So this is some results of a survey that we submitted, or that we distributed to dairy producers a couple years ago now. Recently was accepted by Canadian Journal of Animal Science. We asked producers all across Canada some questions about their feeding strategies, some of the ingredients that they use on farm. And we were able to collect some of their responses. So one of the ingredients that we asked about, we had a whole big list of ingredients and asked producers to select the ingredients that they utilized off of a big long list. But one of those ingredients was straw. And we found that quite a number of dairy producers are using straw in heifer rations, lactating cow rations, and dry cow rations. So in particular, you see my little note here, freestall dairies were more likely to use straw in their heifer or dry cow rations versus tie stall dairies. That's probably because these dairies are more likely to feed heifers and dry cows indoors in confinement versus having them out on pasture. I mean, you can see that it's very common. So almost a third of producers are using straw in their heifer cow rations. A little over a third are using straw in their lactating cow rations, and almost half of dairy producers across Canada who responded to this survey were including straw in their dry cow ration. Now, our question is, can switchgrass replace straw? And so we've done it in all of the experiments that we're going to look at tonight. You're going to see that we use switchgrass as a direct replacement for straw. And if you take a look at the nutrient profile of switchgrass and straw, you can see that there's a lot of similarities. So these are low protein, very high fiber products, forages. They don't provide a lot of additional nutritional value to the dairy cow diet, but they do, again, provide some of that physical function of fiber. So they result in gut fill. They help add bulk to the ration, and provide some of that physical effect that we need in dairy cow rations. Now, another important thing to note that we looked into in that survey was that producers value performance. So we asked producers to rank these 5 factors as what they consider to be most or least important when they are working with their nutritionists to design dairy cow rations. And across the board, producers valued performance. So in heifer rations and lactating cow rations and in dry cow rations, performance ranked very high. Cost and simplicity were a little bit lower ranked. I was a little bit interested to see this because, you know, you're talking about income over feed cost. You would imagine costs to be a little bit higher. Nutrient management was ranked universally low across groups, although Western provinces did rank nutrient management a little bit higher than Ontario did. But across the board, producers value performance. They value feeds that can drive performance. I would be a little bit curious to see, you know, with all of the volatility in the dairy industry that we've seen over the last year, if this would still, if this would change any of our rankings at all. But when we distributed this in 2018, this was the this is how producers ranked these various values. All right, so I'm going to jump in and start talking about some of our experience feeding switchgrass and lactating cow rations. So we've done several experiments over the past couple years looking at switchgrass and lactating cow rations. So the first experiment that we performed, this was presented at our 2019 field day that we did on switchgrass, so I won't be spending a ton of time on it here. I do have some of those slides if we want to talk about it again at the question and answer session at the end. But I'm not going to be talking in detail about each of these experiments because we either presented them in 2019 or the graduate students will be presenting them tonight. But in our first experiment, we had a pretty conventional lactating cow ration. This was done at the Elora Dairy Facility at the University of Guelph. We used either straw or switchgrass, haylage, corn silage, high moisture corn, and the protein supplement. These diets were 16% crude protein. They were about 21% starch and about 34% NDF. In our second experiment, this was relatively similar in terms of ingredients. This was actually used most of the same cows that our first experiment did, but a higher starch ration, so more like a 28% starch, pushing these cows with a little bit hotter ration with a higher starch diet. Now, the experiments that we will be looking at tonight that the graduate students will talk about in more detail, the third experiment that we performed, we actually directly compared spring-baled or fall-baled switchgrass. Compared to straw, again, we had a haylage, a corn silage, a high moisture corn, and a supplement. And Bridget will be presenting this experiment in a little bit, but the spring-baled or the fall-baled switchgrass refers to the timing of harvesting. And one of the things that she actually found in her experiment was that there is a nutritional difference between harvesting in the fall, a slightly less mature switchgrass product versus harvesting in the spring. These diets were relatively low starch, 21% starch, 16% crude protein, and 32% NDF. And our fourth experiment was a little bit more complicated, and Becca will be going over this one in a little bit more detail. We fed straw or switchgrass, corn silage, haylage, high moisture corn, and the supplement. Again, very standard rations here. But we fed them a base diet, so a relatively low starch diet. This diet was 22% starch, 16% crude protein, and about 37% NDF. Relatively low starch base diet. And then we wanted to see, as these cows went from a low starch diet onto a higher starch diet, if they transitioned better or worse, depending on if they received wheat straw or switchgrass. And so after the base diet period, they were on the moderate diet, a moderate starch diet, which was 28% starch, 16% crude protein, and 33% NDF. Our high starch diets were over 30% starch, similar protein, a little bit lower NDF. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the results of these experiments, but I do want to point out our milk response on each of these experiments. So in experiments 1 and 2 that we performed at the Elora facility, we actually saw a decrease in milk yield when cows were fed switchgrass compared to the straw diet. Not a very high inclusion level on the straw, interestingly enough, or switchgrass, interestingly enough, but still we did note a significant decrease, almost a 2-liter decrease on the first experiment and about a liter on the second experiment. In the other experiments we've looked at, we've not seen many direct effects of switchgrass on milk yield, but for example, we did see a reduction in energy corrected milk yield on cows who were receiving the switchgrass diet in our fourth experiment here. So again, the grad students are going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but we see a tendency on some of these diets for switchgrass to actually have potentially a negative effect on production. Although we did see on potentially lower starch diets or low producing cow diets, maybe a little bit less of an impact of feeding switchgrass on milk yield. And so I want to talk a little bit about where I think, based on some of the things that we found and some of our experiences with feeding switchgrass to date, I want to talk a little bit about how I think switchgrass could fit into a lactating cow diet. So it's not, most of you here are probably familiar with the lactation curve, milk yield across the lactation, but in case you're not, in general, cows are going to increase in milk yield for the first few weeks of lactation. They're going to reach a peak milk yield. So we see here at the top of this curve, we refer to this as the peak. And then they're going to gradually decline in milk yield across the rest of lactation. So there's two different spots on the lactation curve, whether they're pre-peak or post-peak. And we refer to a couple different measurements that we might look at when we're describing the lactation curve is where cows end up peaking and how quickly they decline in milk production in late lactation. Obviously, we can expect first lactation cows not to milk as much as older cows. And another interesting thing about these first lactation cows, they're still growing. They still have a growth requirement in addition to a lactation requirement. They won't peak as high, and generally their curves are flatter in addition to being lower. The shape of the lactation curve in first lactation cows tends to be a little bit different. So depending on where cows are in the lactation curve, they're going to have different nutritional needs. So in early lactation, fresh cows and cows that are approaching peak milk, these cows are going to be in negative energy balance because they are going to be producing more milk, more energy in milk than they're able to take in through the diet. These cows are often in negative energy balance. They're also often in negative protein balance. So you see here, this picture demonstrates a cow who's relatively thin. This cow would be mobilizing body fat, and actually she's also mobilizing protein. She is mobilizing her body reserves in order to meet her requirements for energy and protein for milk production. And then as cows progress through later lactation, they're going to be in less severe negative energy balance. Eventually, they're going to become in positive energy balance, where the feed that they take in will exceed the amount of energy that they put out in milk. So we see here that these cows are starting to gain condition. Now, as we approach later lactation, these cows are more likely to start putting on maybe too much body condition. So they're starting to actually increase the amount of body reserves that they have, probably over optimum. And we'll talk about this when we get to dry cows. That can actually cause problems in the next lactation. So a common practice would be to feed two different diets, one for the high producing cows in early lactation and one for the lower producing cows in later lactation. Now, there are some benefits to a single lactating cow group. It is easy to do. It's simple. There's one diet for the whole herd. You don't have to be mixing multiple rations. The downfalls of feeding a single ration throughout the whole lactation would be a reduced income over feed cost. So you're feeding a more expensive ration. Usually rations for higher producing cows are more expensive. You're feeding that for the whole lactation. That can, and you're feeding it to lower producing cows who don't necessarily need it. That can increase your cost of feed for your whole herd. There's often increased manure output of nitrogen and phosphorus. Like I mentioned, there's a risk of overconditioned cows. And there also can be some risk. I put risk of reduced first lactation milk yield. That's often in freestall facilities. If you're housing your first lactation cows with your older cows, having some of that increased competition can hurt first lactation performance. Now, grouping cows by milk yield, having a high or a low producing group, these have several benefits. So as on the flip side, it can increase income over feed costs. You're able to target lower quality forage to your low production group, and you're better able to manage body condition. Now, I want to emphasize here this ability to target lower quality forage to low production groups. Our low production groups are a great way to feed forages that we wouldn't necessarily feed to high producing cows. So for example, if we have a forage such as switchgrass that we think might result in some risk of hurting milk production, we can still potentially feed that to our lower producing cows. These cows we're trying to monitor we're trying to manage their body condition so that they're not gaining excess body condition. And we're trying to still make them eat until the point where they feel satiated. And so feeds such as straw or such as switchgrass, these bulkier feeds that provide that gut fill and that physical effect that don't necessarily harm or that don't necessarily provide additional nutrition, those can be fed really easily during that low period of production and late lactation. So this is one way where I can really see switchgrass being utilized in lactating cow rations. If we're feeding a low cow group where we want to, where we're not in as much risk of having negative energy balance. Now, this is something, if we take a look at some of the survey results, this is one of the questions that we asked. We asked how many rations producers are feeding their lactating cattle. And some of the things that we saw, or one of the things that we saw, and I think this is an area of opportunity that we can use as professionals who work with dairy producers. I think this is an area of opportunity that a lot of dairy producers have, is that the majority of them are still feeding a single lactating cow ration. And so that's across Canada, 81%. Free stalls in Ontario were actually the most likely to be feeding a single lactating cow ration throughout the whole lactation. So I think that this is definitely an area of opportunity that we have when it comes to dairy production and when it comes to optimizing the efficiency of dairy production across Canada. So I want to talk a little bit about dry cow rations, and I'm going to start with talking a little bit about what the purpose of a dry cow ration is and some of the challenges that we have in the dry period. So one of the things that I talked about the lactation curve in the previous section, and in between each lactation curve, you're going to have a period of time, generally about 55 to 60 days. You're going to have some period of time where a cow is at rest. So she's going to spend a period of time on mat leave, so to speak, except it's pre-baby. She's going to spend some time with some time off where she's not making milk. She is only focused on developing that fetus until parturition. Now, the main goal that we have, nutritionally speaking, in that dry period, one of our major goals, and what a lot of the recommendations for feeding cows in the dry period boils down to, is avoiding fat cows, not letting cows get overconditioned in the dry period. And to me, where the dry period, when we're talking about that goal of minimizing body condition score gain, where that actually starts is in that late lactation. So if we're able to feed a low cow ration in late lactation to those cows, we're actually making sure that when they dry off, they're still they're not to the point where they're already overconditioned, because we don't want cows losing body condition in the dry period either. So we want to maintain an optimum body condition score throughout the dry period. So we want to minimize body condition score gains, minimize some of that fat deposition, minimize them building their fat stores. And at the same time, we want to be sure that we're maximizing dry matter intake. And we don't want to maximize dry matter intake by feeding up a high energy or a high starch ration. We want to feed them a bulky ration that they can eat and feel full. And so a lot of times, some of these lower quality forages are going to play a role in these dry cow diets that way. Now, this is where the whole idea of a Goldilocks diet comes in. You may have heard of this before. I used to ask my students where they thought the name Goldilocks came from, and they usually thought that it was from the color. So Goldilocks diets are going to include a high amount of straw typically. And so they always thought that it was called Goldilocks because it was kind of a yellow color from the straw that was included at such a high level in the ration. But the idea of a Goldilocks diet actually comes from the story of Goldilocks and the three pigs. Nope, and the three bears. There's three little pigs and the big bad wolf. Goldilocks and the three bears. So it's the whole idea of not too much, not too little. You want it to be just right. And so the idea of a Goldilocks diet is that you're feeding a low energy diet that can be consumed free choice. And so cows will meet, if it's balanced correctly, Cows will meet their requirements only if they consume all the feed they can until they're stuffed. And if they consume all the feed that they have until they're stuffed, they're going to consume not too little energy and not too much energy. It's going to be just right. So these can also be referred to as, often referred to as a moderate energy, high forage diet. But Goldilocks would be the term that you'd often hear in the vernacular there. Often these will include some high quality feeds, usually a corn silage or a good grass or legume silage, some high quality hay, these really fine, really good quality feed ingredients that we might be feeding to our lactating cows, except not at a high level. We're feeding these higher quality feeds to meet the energy and protein requirements that those cows have, and then we're filling the rest of it in with a bulky feed that just takes up room, so that these cows, it's mixed in uniformly with these other high quality feeds, and they eat and eat and eat and eat it, but they feel full because we're including some of these bulky feeds such as wheat straw. But as we've seen, we can actually include switchgrass as a replacement for wheat straw successfully in diets like this. So some benefits and challenges of the Goldilocks diet. Goldilocks diets are really good at reducing the incidence of displaced abomasum or twisted guts in early lactation. They are able to, so there's enough rumen fill, and the straw or the switchgrass will break down so slowly that it doesn't leave the rumen rapidly. So even if you have a depression in feed intake after calving, there's still going to be enough gut fill remaining that it will keep everything in place, even if cows go off feed. Where DAs happen is if cows go off feed and all of a sudden there's a lot of room inside, the calf is gone, everything associated with pregnancy is gone, rumen isn't as full, and everything starts to kind of shift around. But with this Goldilocks diet, or this the diet's high in bulky feeds with a lot of rumen fill, it kind of helps keep everything where it's supposed to be. It also has, to some extent, a stabilizing effect on feed intake. There's been a field data demonstrating a decrease in assisted calvings, decrease in some of these clinical transition cow disorders that we often see. There's limited milk data, but some people will say on these diets that there can be a decline in peaks. Cows don't take off as quickly, but it's possible, based on some of the data that we have, that there's improved persistency later in that second part of lactation. And these feeds these diets will often be automatically a little bit lower in DCAT, and I'll talk about DCAT a little bit more in a minute. But because they include feeds that tend to be lower in potassium, this lowers the DCAT of the ration. And they're simpler to manage. You feed kind of like in the lactating cow period. We want to feed two groups in the lactating cow period. Feeding a single ration in the dry period is kind of the inverse of that, where it's actually, there's some benefit to feeding a single ration throughout the whole dry period. Little bit of back and forth on that we'll talk about in a little bit. Some challenges to the Goldilocks diet. This is some 2010 data. This isn't hard data. I'll show you some hard data in a minute. But these were webinar listeners in the US. And of this sample of people who were listening to this, I think it was Hordes Dairymen that put on this webinar, 2/3 of them preferred 2 diets to 1 diet. And again, that's US data. Canada, it's a little bit different. If you're feeding any additives and you're feeding a single Goldilocks diet over the whole dry period, it can be expensive to feed them for the whole dry period. There's still a little bit on, it's one of the benefits of having 2 diets is you can feed one that's closer to lactating cow ration during the close-up period when cows are close to calving. The effect on rumen adaptation is still a little bit unclear. And it can be challenging to prevent sorting. So cows will try to pick out, you're including some high quality ingredients with some not high quality ingredients. Cows will have a tendency to want to pick out the good stuff. And they're pretty good at doing it too. So it's really important that whether you're feeding straw or switchgrass or something else, that bulky feed is chopped fine enough. Not so fine that you have just chaff, but 1 to 2 inches is a good chop length for some of those, for preventing sorting out of those ration. Adding moisture, adding a little bit of water can be another effective way to handle some of that. We've got some really interesting data published out of the University of Guelph recently showing the effects of short chop length and adding moisture on feeding behavior in dry cows. It's also really important to ensure continuous access to TMR and to monitor dry matter content and manage the ingredients that way. So again, this is the same survey. We actually have more data showing that more producers, the fair amount of producers in Canada tend to feed one diet through the whole dry period. Western provinces, it's a little less likely. They're more evenly split between feeding one or two. Ontario tie stalls really like feeding just one. It's a little unclear though whether this is a true TMR or whether this is again just putting dry cows out on pasture. And the question you might be wondering about these couple responses that say 3+. The question here was how many rations you feed your dry cows and pre-fresh heifers. So this would be assuming that your pre-fresh heifers are fed something different than your dry cows. So we have done some experiments looking, or an experiment looking at switchgrass and dry cow rations. And this was published or presented in 2019, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this either. But cows were enrolled in a Goldilocks diet, which consisted of switchgrass or straw, corn silage, and a dry cow supplement. And then we monitored these cows for the first month after calving. So there were a total of 36 cows enrolled on this experiment. And we actually found when we looked at, there was a little bit of an effect on postpartum body condition score. This is probably not a biologically significant relationship or a biologically significant difference, even though it is a statistical difference. But we didn't see a whole lot of difference postpartum between these two. So we think that switchgrass can be a really great replacement for straw in these dry cow diets potentially. Now, there is some benefit to grouping cows separate. So to date, I've been looking at feeding dry cows in a Goldilocks type diet. And there is some benefit though to feeding two different groups of cattle in the dry period. So feeding we call these a far off and a close up group, or you might hear this referred to as a pre-fresh group. This is well before calving and close to calving. And one of the benefits of this is that you can actually, you have the ability to reduce hypocalcemia or milk fever by feeding an anionic diet via feeding a DCAD. So a DCAD is going to be a DCAD is what we refer to as dietary cation anion difference. And we can feed a positive DCAD or a negative DCAD. In feeding a negative DCAD, you can see the equation here. We basically add up our cations and we add up our anions and we take the difference. If a DCAD is negative, our anions will be greater than our cations in the ration. So during a dry period, we want that DCAD to be negative. And this can help reduce the incidence of milk fever. The way it does this is it causes a slight metabolic acidosis. This basically starts the cow mobilizing calcium, like switching on those mechanisms to mobilize calcium before she needs to do that to meet the calcium demands of milk production and early lactation. So one of the ways that we can feed it, or there's a few different steps to go to monitoring the DCAD of your dry cow diets and making sure that the DCAD is negative. So often, if we take a look back at this equation, if you want this equation to be negative, you can increase the anion portion of the equation, or you can decrease the cation portion of the equation. Either of those will make that equation more negative. And so we can add anionic salts, or we can feed products such as biochlor or soy chlor. These are products that have had anionic salts added to them. And another way that we can do this is by feeding forages, avoiding feeding forages that are high in potassium. So feeding some of those more low potassium diets. And this should be monitored with urine pH. So this is what the graph over here demonstrates is that as urine pH lowers, the DCAD of the diet is more negative and you have an actual metabolic acidosis occurring. Now, if we take a look back at what we talked about previously, in terms of the difference between a straw and a switchgrass diet, you can see that we already referred to straw as a low potassium feed, but switchgrass is substantially lower in potassium, and this is spring-baled switchgrass. It's substantially lower than straw in terms of potassium content. So we're able to feed. So one of the things about DCAD is you don't want to feed anionic salts for an extended period of time before calving. Those anionic salts, they tend to put cows off feed. They tend to cause additional problems if they're fed for a very extended period of time. But we can adjust and scooch that DCAD closer to negative by feeding more of these low potassium diets. And so this is the reason why we think straw or switchgrass is a great replacement for straw in these dry cow rations. I want to briefly, to wrap up here, talk about heifer rations. And I put a big old question mark right here because we haven't actually done any research in heifer rations. But I would expect, based on the research that we've done, that switchgrass could be used in heifer rations. And so I'll talk a little bit how I think that could potentially happen. So one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about heifers, these are post-weaning heifers. These are heifers that they've been weaned. They're ruminants at this point. They are consuming forages. They have a functioning rumen post-weaning, between weaning and first calving. And one of the challenges we have with feeding heifers is that they, much like dry cows, heifers like to put on extra body condition. Heifers will like to kind of store away some of those fat stores for later on. And that can be a problem, just like in dry cows, that can be a problem in heifers as well. So we have a couple different, we want to limit the amount of energy that heifers are getting. So we want to make sure that these heifers are still growing. We don't want to feed such little energy that they can't continue to grow. But we definitely want to be providing protein and moderating their energy intake. And we can do that in a couple different ways. So one of the ways you can do that is by feeding heifers, limit feeding heifers. Feeding them at like 80% of what their ad libitum intake would be. You can also do that by, just like the dry cows, you can do that by bulking up the heifer ration with some of those low nutrient density feeds. Now this is where I think that straw or switchgrass could be a potentially good additive into these diets. So fiber is a great tool when we're moderating heifer intake. Fiber is something that we can adjust to moderate heifer energy intake. We can include it at relatively high levels if we want heifers to be able to eat all they want, or at lower levels if we're wanting heifers to limit feed. And one of the things that we can do also is we can actually, by feeding some of these lower, less digestible rations, we can in effect limit their dry matter intake. We have that gut fill, and that allows heifers to, again, meet but not exceed those energy requirements. And so you can see here I have some examples. These were pulled from Penn State Extension publications, just some general examples of low and high forage rations for heifers. So these are heifers at 4 months and 23 months. We have a lower forage and a higher forage. And you can take a look here at some of the ingredients that are included. And one of them is grass hay, and tends to be a little bit more, maybe less digestible grass hay. Wheat midds also potentially source of fiber in here, but grass hay or some of these straw, we saw that a lot of producers in Canada are including their straw in their heifer rations. Including these is a great way to modulate heifer energy intake. And this is just again some of the expected nutrients that we could see off of these example diets. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is that we're anticipating a higher dry matter intake, a slightly higher dry matter intake on these higher forage diets. But similar body weight, similar energy intake, but a higher dry matter intake, and so therefore a lower metabolizable energy per unit of dry matter that those cows are consuming. So I think I'm getting pretty close to my time. Again, we're going to take questions at the end, and I'd love to talk to you guys about this more at that point, or you folks more about this at that point. But I'd want to just kind of wrap up with a couple concluding thoughts. Couple lessons that we learned, and this is an image of some of the switchgrass that we fed on a couple of our studies, and you can see that it has some contamination And just like any forage, I think it's really important to remember that switchgrass should, that quality is going to always, always, always be important when you're talking about forages that you feed to dairy cattle. So this is a way to avoid performance bottlenecks, a way to avoid cows going off feed or having a depression of milk production, anything like that. Making sure that our feed quality is top notch is always going to be important to a dairy producer, and always going to be important to a nutritionist. So more so that I feel than a lot of others, like small ruminants or beef producers, dairy producers really value high quality feeds that aren't going to put cows off feed. And then when maximum dry matter intake is required, lower quality may still be acceptable. Not contamination, not high toxin levels or anything that's gonna cause health problems. But every year, I mean, we value quality feed, but there's always the reality of harvest that we have to deal with. And so often the way that producers will deal with this is by feeding these feeds to low producing cows, heifers, and to dry cows. And what I think we've learned is that switchgrass will often work for those cows. Switchgrass will often work for those cows where we don't necessarily need, we're not looking for the best performance. We're just looking to, we're looking for that effective fiber. We're looking for that gut fill. And assuming it's not going to cause health problems or put cows off feed, switchgrass seems to be a really great replacement in some of those cases. And in fact, switchgrass might potentially have additional benefits, particularly when we start talking about dry cows, depending on the dry period strategies that you're working with on a given farm. And I just want to end, I have questions there at the top, but I'm not taking questions yet. We're going to do a Q&A at the end. I do want to acknowledge our funding for these experiments. And these were the same for the next two speakers that you'll listen to. All of these experiments that you're going to hear about tonight were funded through the Ontario Food and Innovation Alliance. So that when we received that grant, it was the OMAFRA U of G partnership, and with in-kind contributions and financial consideration from the Ontario Biomass Producers Cooperative. So we really want to thank these groups for funding these studies. You won't hear that repeatedly throughout the night, but just know that all of the experiments that we've talked about and that the graduate students are going to present, all of them were funded through these groups. So I appreciate your time. And I think that puts me at almost exactly 40 minutes. And so I will turn it back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter, and what a great presentation that was. It was great to kind of get how we can use switchgrass in our dairy rations up to this point. We're going to continue the conversation on using switchgrass in dairy with Bridget LeMay. Bridget is a master's candidate at the University of Guelph in the Animal Bioscience Department. So welcome, Bridget.
All right, hi everyone. I'm just gonna share my presentation here. All right, so as Michelle just said, my name is Bridget and I am a master's student at the University of Guelph, and my presentation tonight is gonna focus on some of my research as a master's student, looking at the practical applications for including switchgrass harvested either in the fall or spring in lactating rations. So first, I want to briefly summarize some of the objectives we aim to cover in this research. First, we sought to assess the chemical composition of wheat straw, fall-baled switchgrass, and spring-baled switchgrass, and to confirm if the differences that we've previously seen in the literature for the two harvest timings were apparent in the switchgrass we had harvested for this trial. Next, we sought to assess if the cows were indeed demonstrating typical feed sorting given a different type of forage in the ration, and if the extent of the sorting differed based on forage type. Then we looked at the milk yield and components of the cows in the trial to see if any changes were apparent given that the cows are consuming a ration with different forages included. And finally, we looked to assess if blended metabolites could indicate a change in the energy balance given the ration with a different forage. So then we'll move on about how we went about reaching these objectives. So we had one ration formulated that represented a typical Southwest Ontario diet and included either wheat straw, fall-baled switchgrass, or spring-baled switchgrass as the source of long stem fiber to provide the physically effective fiber and gut fill that Gail just mentioned earlier. The study was done at the University of Guelph Ridgetown College campus, and we used 12 mid-lactation Holstein cows who were randomly assigned to one of 3 diets containing fall-baled switchgrass, spring-baled switchgrass, or wheat straw. And each cow was fed the ration for 10 days for an adaptation period, where refusals were measured. Sorry, there's some thunder there. Measured in the amount offered, adjusted daily to target a 10% refusal rate. And they were offered a minimum of 50 kilograms a day and a max of 80. So the cows were offered the ration twice a day and milk twice a day. On the 11th day, a 4-day sampling period started where yield was measured and recorded at all milkings and a milk sample taken for analysis at a later date. A sample of refusals was collected prior to the morning feed, and particle size distribution was assessed using a Penn State particle separator. And blood samples were also taken daily during these 4 days prior to the morning feed. At the end of the 4-day sampling period, cows were switched onto one of the other trial rations, and the process repeated until all the cows had consumed all the rations. At the start of each period, a forage sample was also taken for analysis, and feed samples were taken daily throughout the entire trial. So here we can see the ration formulation. So on the left-hand side here, we can see the ration composition on a % dry matter basis. So the ration consisted of a crude protein of about 16%, an NDF level of about 32, 21% starch, 38% non-fiber carbohydrates, and a 4% fat. And then on the right here, we can see the ingredient breakdown on, again, a dry matter basis. So the test forages straw, the spring-baled switchgrass, and the fall-baled switchgrass were included at just under 2% of the total ration, which worked out to be about 0.5 kilograms a day per cow. And then we had the haylage included at just under 40%, the corn silage at 26%, our high moisture corn at 17%, along with the energy booster, and then the lactating supplement at just under 16%. So then we'll look at next what we measured. As I mentioned a few slides back, a sample of the test forages was taken at the start of each period to be sent for an analysis of chemical composition, which focused on crude protein, rumen degradable protein, NDF, ADF, ash, potassium, and calcium, as well as non-fiber carbohydrates. Feed samples were taken daily over the course of the trial and sent for analysis of crude protein, NDF, ADF, ash, and non-fiber carbohydrates, just to make sure that the rations that the cows were consuming did indeed match what the ration was formulated for. Refusals were measured daily, and the samples taken at the sampling days, to assess the extent of sorting. Milk yield was recorded and samples taken and sent for component analysis, as well as somatic cell count and milk urea nitrogen levels. And then blood samples were spun down using a centrifuge, and the serum sent for analysis of glucose, NEFA, and BHB at a later date. So then we can move on to what we found and our results for the trial. So as you can see here, this table is showing us the chemical composition of the different forages that we use. So the different letters throughout this table are just showing where things were different in the 2 forages. So for all 3, the dry matter was similar, as was the rumen degradable protein, but that's where the similarities between them pretty much end. Crude protein was notably higher in the fall-baled switchgrass. You can see it there, it's hovering around 5%, whereas wheat straw was a bit lower at just about 3.7, and then the spring-baled switchgrass is a lot lower at just under 3%. Our ADF, the wheat straw is our highest one there, just about 61%, followed by the spring-baled switchgrass, and then the fall-baled switchgrass at 46%. NDF followed a kind of a similar pattern. The wheat straw and the spring-baled switchgrass weren't significantly different, but there was a bit of a numerical difference there, whereas the fall-baled switchgrass was much, much lower at just under 70% NDF content. For the ash content, the fall-baled switchgrass was the highest. The wheat straw for this one was kind of a mid-ground. It wasn't different from the fall-baled, but it wasn't different from the spring-baled switchgrass, but the two switchgrasses did differ. Calcium, the wheat straw was a little bit lower than both of them. Potassium kind of followed a similar trend, and the non-fiber carbohydrates are the other interesting thing, with the fall-baled switchgrass being quite a bit higher at around 18%, and the wheat straw and switchgrass hovering between 10 to 13%. So these differences here that you'll see, we'll talk about later, but they do kind of follow what we've previously seen when switchgrass has been harvested in these two different time points. So then we looked at the particle size distribution of our diets. I don't have the table here, but we did analyze the rations themselves for particle size to make sure that we had the mix of the long, medium, and short particles that you want to provide that physically effective fiber. So the three rations were fairly similar, with the physically effective fiber content ranging from 29 to 31%. And then this table here is actually the feed sorting that we got based on the refusals that we measured. So the values for each fraction here, the long, medium, and short, and the fine, any category where it's under 100 is representing that the cow did sort against that fraction. So for all of them here, the long fraction was sorted against, and then anything over 100, the cows sorted for, so they consume preferentially. The important thing to notice is that while sorting was displayed here, the cows didn't sort, the extent of sorting didn't differ between any of the rations. So then we have our milk yield component and yield data. As Gail mentioned earlier, we didn't see much of a change in any of our production data here. Yield was fairly similar across the board, anywhere from 28 to 27 kilograms a day. Our fat production averaged about 1.2 kilograms a day, with the percent anywhere from 4.2 to 4.5. Protein production was just under a kilogram a day, with the percent around 3.4. Our energy corrected milk again followed the same pattern, pretty consistent. Same with the feed efficiency and the energy corrected milk feed efficiency. Somatic cell count again was fairly similar, but the main difference that we observed here is that our milk urea nitrogen levels were actually lower in the cows that consumed the fall-baled switchgrass ration for this trial. So we'll just go over what this means quickly here. So first of all, the forages, the differences that we found between the fall-baled switchgrass and the spring-baled switchgrass did match what has previously been recorded in the literature for harvest timing. And it also matches up with why spring-baled switchgrass is more commonly used. It's a bit closer to the wheat straw. And in terms of other uses, the spring-baled switchgrass has more desirable qualities for things like the biofuel industry, where switchgrass was kind of originally started with. Then for the sorting, typically cows are going to sort for the short concentrates and against the long fibrous particles. Here we did see that, but the extent of sorting didn't differ, which is important because different forages have previously been shown to influence the extent of sorting in lactating rations. So oat and hay versus other kinds of hay have been shown to increase the extent of sorting seen, which can have negative impacts on your performance and production, given that cows are consuming a less balanced diet. Replacing wheat straw with switchgrass did not cause significant negative energy balance regardless of harvest timing, which we didn't really expect to see because we didn't alter the energy content of the diet, and they were mid-lactation cows, so it would have been a pretty drastic change to see anything. And then finally, the research that we saw here suggests that the fall-baled switchgrass can offer increased nitrogen use efficiency, possibly stemming from the increased NFC content in the fall-baled switchgrass, but we would need to look into that further to say for sure. So just some concluding statements that we found is that fall-baled switchgrass and the spring-baled switchgrass are equally adequate when substituted for wheat straw in terms of milk yield and component production. The fall-baled switchgrass may offer some additional health performance benefits in terms of decreasing the milk urea nitrogen levels. And so finally, at an inclusion rate of 2% on a dry matter basis, for mid-lactation cows, both fall-billed switchgrass and spring-billed switchgrass can be utilized in rations for mid-lactation cows. And I think that wraps up everything I had. Questions I'll take at the end as well. And then just some ideas for future research that we had discussed based on what we found in the trials that Gail mentioned earlier. And this one, is there potential for increasing the inclusion rate of the fall-billed switchgrass to strengthen the treatment effect observed on the milk urea nitrogen levels? Doing studies with more cows to kind of get a better idea if it would be feasible and like an on-farm application, and then using cows in early lactation to assess if the chemical composition differences between the two types of switchgrass have more of an effect. So thank you for your time, everyone, and that's all I have tonight.
Thanks very much, Bridget, and we wish you all the best as you finish your master's in the next coming months. Next, we have Rebecca Nagel. Rebecca is also a master's student candidate at the University of Guelph in animal bioscience. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so as she said, my name is Rebecca Nagel, and I'm a student at the University of Guelph. So my project was feeding switchgrass hay as a replacement for wheat straw in lactating dairy cow rations when transitioned from a low starch to a moderate or high starch diet. So why is this project relevant? Well, high starch diets have been incorporated into the dairy industry to increase and meet production goals. However, when starch is increased, rumen pH can drop due to an accumulation of volatile fatty acids, or known as VFAs, in the rumen. And when there's abrupt diet change, VFAs can accumulate because the rumen has not yet adapted to the diet change. This can lead to the potential issue of acidosis and milk fat depression that can result in depressed milk production and depressed dry matter intake. One method to reduce this risk of acidosis and milk fat depression is to incorporate forages that provide adequate physically effective fiber to promote chewing and saliva production that will reduce rumen pH. Wheat straw provides an excellent source of physically effective fiber while providing little nutritional value, and anecdotes from dairy producers have suggested that switchgrass can aid in the prevention of milk fat depression. Switchgrass hay has the potential to be a sustainable alternative to wheat straw when the markets are inconsistent, as they both have a similar nutritional value. So the objectives of this study were to determine how switchgrass hay compares with wheat straw when used as a direct replacement in higher starch rations and as a transition from a low starch to a moderate or high starch diet. So this is the experimental design. So cows were on the adaptation diet, or the base diet, with the direct substitution of either wheat straw or switchgrass hay for 10 days before transitioning onto the moderate or high starch diets for 4 days. Only 1 day of sampling occurred for the base diets, and all the transition diets were sampled. In vitro batch cultures were also conducted in all of the TMRs and each individual test forage. So this study used 12 mid-lactation cows housed in tie stalls at the Ridgetown Dairy Facility. On sampling days, milk samples were collected 2 times per day, and milk yield was monitored using the DeLaval Delpro. Fecal samples, as well as refusals and TMRs for the shaker boxes, were collected in the mornings, and TMR and forage samples were also collected for the in vitro once at the beginning of the experiment. So all the diets used were formulated to be the same within each starch level, with the direct substitution of either wheat straw or switchgrass hay. Also, all the diets had contained the same % of crude protein and test forage inclusion. So this is the nutrient and ingredient composition of the 2 base diets, or adaptation diets. These were the diets that were fed for 10 days, and the data is referred to as day 0 throughout. These diets included a starch level of around 22% of the diet. So these are the nutrient and ingredient composition for the moderate starch diets, and these were fed for 4 days after the base diets. Starch in these diets were around 28% of diet dry matter. And to increase the starch, corn silage, high moisture corn, and soybean meal was included at a greater rate in the ration than what the base diets were. And then these are the nutrient ingredient composition for the high starch diets. Starch in these diets were around 33% of diet dry matter. And to increase the starch similar to the moderate starch diets, corn silage, high moisture corn, and soybean meal were included at a greater rate. So these are the results. Before I start talking about the results, DMD stands for dry matter disappearance, and that is how much the substrate disappeared when in the replicated rumen. And gas production was measured and it will increase as fermentation increases. So batch culture results showed that there was no effect of wheat straw or switchgrass hay on the in vitro batch cultures. There were several starch effects though. The base diets had a greater pH than the high starch diets, but the moderate starch diets were not different than either the base diet or the high starch diets. Also, gas production was not different between the base, moderate, or high starch diets. However, gas production was lower for the test forages. Also, pH was higher for the wheat straw and switchgrass hay diets than all other treatment diets. Not surprisingly, wheat straw and switchgrass hay were less digestible than the TMRs. It's also worth noting that although not statistically different, switchgrass hay is numerically less digestible than wheat straw. So these are the results, and between the two base diets, and they're represented as day 0 in the data, there is no difference between any variables that were measured. So there were no differences between treatments before the cows transitioned onto either the moderate or the high starch diets. And it's also important to note that there was only 1 day of data collected for these base diets. So the next set of slides will all look very similar. Day 0 represents the base diets, and day 1 to 4 will represent either the moderate or high starch diets. The gray lines will represent the wheat straw diets, and the black will represent switchgrass hay diets. The solid lines are the moderate starch diets, and the dotted lines are the high starch diets. So from days 1 to 4, both dry matter intake and milk yield were not affected by the inclusion of wheat straw or switchgrass hay in the ration. However, the cows on the high starch diets had a greater dry matter intake and milk yield than the moderate starch diets. Cows on the high starch treatments could have a greater dry matter intake than cows on the moderate starch diets, potentially due to the moderate starch diets containing more fiber and therefore a reduced passage rate compared to cows on the high starch diets. So there was no difference of forage type on the milk fat percent, but cows on the moderate starch diets had a greater milk fat percent as expected. A decline in milk fat can occur when fermentable carbohydrates like starch is increased in the ration. This can change rumen fermentation as propionate production is increased and acetate is decreasing due to starch in the diet. Also, a decrease in particle size and physically effective fiber can be observed when concentrates are replaced for forages. This rumen environment can decrease milk fatty acid synthesis by a reduction in the precursor acetate, and cows can experience low milk fat. However, milk fat yield was greater for cows on the wheat straw diets than the switchgrass hay rations. This could be due to the numerically lower milk fat percent the switchgrass cows had. Results from our batch culture work indicated that switchgrass hay was numerically less digestible than wheat straw. So potentially due to slower rumen fermentation, switchgrass hay could have limited acetate production and reduced milk fat synthesis. So there was no effective treatment on milk protein percent. Cows fed the wheat straw diets tended to have a greater milk protein yield than the switchgrass hay diets. This suggests that when switchgrass hay is fed in the diet, it may potentially decrease microbial protein synthesis, thus decreasing milk protein synthesis. And the rumen microbes will depend on feed fermentation to provide them energy to function. Although the diets were numerically similar within each experiment, microbial protein synthesis can still differ. Although cows fed the high starch diets had a greater milk protein percent than the moderate starch diets, the high starch diets could have provided more energy for microbial protein synthesis and therefore increasing milk protein synthesis. So MUN was both affected by forage type and starch inclusion. Cows that were fed the switchgrass hay diets had a greater MUN than the wheat straw diets. It is not clear what caused the increase in nitrogen waste, but one possibility is that switchgrass hay may degrade slower than wheat straw in the rumen, potentially providing the microbes with less energy for urea recycling and resulting in greater urea excretion into the milk. Also, cows on the moderate starch diets had a greater MUN than cows on the cows on the moderate starch diets had a greater MUN than cows on the high starch diets. And this could potentially be due to the high starch diets providing more energy for urea recycling and therefore less excretion of urea into the milk. So feeding efficiencies were calculated by dividing milk yield or energy corrected milk yield by dry matter intake. There was no effective forage on the feeding efficiencies. There was, however, a starch effect. So cows on the high starch diet for both of these feeding efficiencies were less efficient at converting feed to milk than the moderate starch diets. So before I get into the feed sorting results, the sorting value tells you if a cow is sorting or not. So sorting values over 100 indicate if they were sorting for that particle size in their diet, and sorting values below 100 indicate that the cow was sorting against that particle size in their diet. So sorting values equal to 100 indicate that no sorting occurred. So the bar graph with the asterisk means that the cow sorted. So all cows, regardless of treatment, sorted against the longer forage particles, which is typically seen in cows. Cows on the switchgrass hay diet sorted against the longer forage particles to a lesser extent than the wheat straw diets. And cows on the high starch diets sorted against the longer forage particles to a lesser extent than the moderate starch diets. Several studies have shown that cows will sort for the longer forage particles containing physically effective fiber when rumen pH is low to help alleviate it. Cows on the high starch diets may have been potentially experiencing a lower rumen pH as they did sort to a lesser extent than the moderate starch diets. Also, batch culture results demonstrated that the pH values for the high starch diets were numerically lower than the moderate starch diets. However, pH values were very similar for both wheat straw and switchgrass hay. So this suggests that when cows are fed switchgrass hay, they will sort less than when wheat straw is included in the diet, potentially due to palatability differences. And regardless of treatment, cows sorted against the finer particles, which is inconsistent with other experiments. Potentially in this experiment, the corners of the manger boxes were harder to reach, contributing to sorting against the finer particles. So the manure analysis showed no differences between starch levels, but there was a tendency for cows on the switchgrass hay diets to have a greater percentage of longer particles and a lesser percentage of smaller particles in the manure than the wheat straw diets. A possible cause of the switchgrass hay diets having a greater amount of longer manure particles could be due to poor rumen fermentation of switchgrass hay. Particle size in the manure will reflect digestion in the rumen, as there is little particle reduction in the lower GI tract. Also, batch culture results indicated that it was less digestible numerically than wheat straw. So our results indicated that under these conditions, switchgrass hay inclusion did not affect dry matter intake or milk yield, but it did depress milk fat yield and tended to depress milk protein yield compared to cows on wheat straw diets. Results imply that switchgrass hay in the rumen is less digestible than wheat straw, potentially limiting milk fat yield due to the slow fermentation of switchgrass hay. This suggests that switchgrass hay did not perform as well as wheat straw. When cows are fed the high starch diets, they had a greater dry matter intake, milk yield, and protein production, but a lower milk fat percent than cows in the moderate starch diets. Overall, these results did not support our hypothesis that cows fed switchgrass hay would handle the adaptation from a low starch to a moderate or high starch diet better than cows fed wheat straw as a forage source. I would recommend feeding switchgrass hay to cows that don't require high quality forages to meet their production goals. So future implications and research. So although switchgrass hay may not be an adequate replacement for wheat straw at higher starch inclusion levels, this research provides evidence that feeding switchgrass hay to lactating dairy cows is safe for ruminant consumption, and there's potential to feed switchgrass hay as an adequate replacement in lower starch diets. From the results of this research, I would not recommend feeding switchgrass hay in higher starch diets when the cost of wheat straw and switchgrass hay are comparable, as this research has shown, to lower cow performance. But I would consider feeding it in higher starch diets if the cost of feeding wheat straw was limiting. However, I would also consider feeding switchgrass hay to lactating dairy cows in lower starch diets, although I think further research is needed. So along with the sponsors Gail had mentioned, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Paul Loomis for the help with sampling and trial setup. I would also like to thank the Ridgetown Dairy Facility staff for all of their help with the cows. And I would also like to thank Dr. Katie Wood and Dr. Gail Carpenter for all their help along the way, as well as thank you to all the students at Ridgetown that helped with the trial and my lab mates for helping me conduct my research. Thanks for listening. If anyone has any questions, I guess we'll do them in the queue after. And if you have any other questions, my email is below, so you can contact me there too. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Becca, and we look forward to some question and answering coming up soon, and wish you the best as you finish your master's.